I just want to spend a few minutes thinking about what kind of worshippers we want to be. What kind of worshippers do we want to be? And I don't just mean with what happens here, I mean with our whole lives. What kind of worshippers will we be? I want to look again at those words that are in Luke chapter 7, if anyone wants to follow along. But as we do, it can be a trap we can fall into whenever we think about worship, whenever we think about what kind of worship we'll give and the ways that we'll worship, that we can inadvertently make it about us. I've been in a number of conversations in my life where people have come out of a church service and started talking about whether or not they liked the worship. And my response, inwardly, if not always externally, is, I don't think that matters, because we weren't worshipping you. It doesn't matter whether you liked it or not, or enjoyed it or not. What mattered was whether it gave glory to Jesus, whether it gave God something that was worthy of him. It's not about us, it's about him. So as we gather this evening to worship Jesus, that's what it's all about. So when I ask the question of what kind of worshipper we want to be, I'm not saying which kind of worshipper will we enjoy being the most. I'm talking about what kind of worship is it that gives God what he is really worth. This passage actually compares two different people. I just read the bit about the woman, but there's a Pharisee involved as well. So in Luke 7, verse 36 onwards, we read this. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. We'll pause there for a moment. It's hard to think of two more different characters than this Pharisee and this sinful woman. He's a man, she's a woman. He's a Pharisee who would have been thought of and known for being pure and righteous and good and upright, and people would have looked up to him. She was known. She had a reputation as a sinful woman. We don't know anything more than that. The likelihood is she was a prostitute, and she was known for her trade, known for who she was and the kinds of things she'd done. But whatever it was, she'd lived a life that people didn't want anything to do with, whereas the Pharisee, people would have wanted to be known by and wanted to know. So at a human level, two very different people. But then look at the way that they relate to Jesus. It starts with the Pharisee inviting Jesus into his house. But then what do we read of the woman? A woman who lived there, when she learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she came to him. We get a picture of the Pharisee, this man who we later find out is called Simon, and he says to Jesus, I'm hosting a party, I want you to come to me. Whereas she says, Jesus is there, I'm going to go to him. It's a world of difference between living our lives saying, this is my life, this is how it is, now Jesus, come and be part of it. Compared that with a totally different way of living life, which is saying, Jesus, where are you? What are you doing? I'm going to go and find that. The truth is that Jesus is always on the move. Jesus is always doing something. Jesus is always somewhere. And a life of worship, of being overwhelmed by Jesus, it starts by saying, where are you? I'm going to go to you. Alfred, as we were talking before the service, she had a really simple but beautiful and amazing story of something that he got to witness this week. And I just asked whether he would share it, because it's totally in line with this. There's a microphone. There you go.
So I had the privilege to attend Hillsong, and Thursday morning, arrived there, rushed there, trains, get to my seat, sit down next to somebody, and we sing some worship songs. All along, God is working. I was at that point not aware of it. I'm sitting next to a lady, and we have to introduce ourselves and say, hi, I'm Alfred, and I say, are you from Hillsong? And she says, no, I'm from the street. And we continue with the worship, and I don't have a chance to ask her further about that. After the second session at Hillsong, we break up, and we walk together through thousands of people out down the stairs. And I start to talk to her, and I ask her, so what do you mean you're from the street? And she said, well, I was on my way to work. I hate my job. And I decided, rather than go to my office, I'll go to the shops and just spend the day shopping. And that's how she ended up at the O2. And she got there, and there were thousands of people clearly going to a conference of some sort. And she asked them, what's it? And they said Hillsong, which didn't mean anything to her. But she decided to buy a ticket. And she came in, and she sat next to me. And I, sort of half confused, asked her, so tell me more. And do you have a faith? And have you made a decision for Jesus? She said, no, but I want to. And as we walked down the stairs, she made a decision for Jesus. And miracles happen. Miracles happen.
Incredible. Jesus was doing something in a conference, and a woman who had no intention ended up getting involved in being part of it. And as a result, there's a new worshipper. There's a new worshipper in the world because Jesus was doing something, and people were flocking to it. And as a result, someone got caught up in that and went along as well. One of the things that happens when we get caught up with the life of Jesus is that people might come with us. It's never the point of worship. The point of worship is always to give glory and honor and everything that's due to Jesus. But one of the results of being a worshipper from time to time is that people will come with us on that journey of worship. And I just think that's amazing. An amazing story to share because it's an amazing thing that happened. This woman was all about going where Jesus was. That's one thing that I think being a worshipper is. Then as we carry on with it, we hear that she's come there, not empty-handed. She's come with an alabaster jar of perfume that she intends to use as part of her worship to Jesus. She's come with this thing. It would have been pricey. Alabaster jar full of perfume, and it would have cost her a lot. Worship costs something. I believe worship always has to cost us something. Worship is about giving something to God, but it's not giving unless it's something that has cost us. That's just holding on and asking Jesus to share it with us a little bit. What does it look like for worship to cost us? Well, in a setting like this, it may not be extremely costly, but we might from time to time look silly. We might from time to time speak something out and get all of our words completely mumbled and jumbled. That might be something that it costs us, and that's okay. We might be worried about the reputation that we have before people and what they'll think of us. That might cost us something. But what does it look like to worship Jesus, to be worshippers of him in a way that costs us in the rest of our lives? Or sometimes it might look financial. Is it outrageous to suggest that from time to time, God might want us to give up some of that which we have? Might it be possible that from time to time, God might ask us to remortgage our houses or dip into our savings or clear out our savings? For this woman, what she did was incredibly costly. We should never rule out the fact that God might want us to do something that costs us something. He's always worth it. We could never give him everything that he's worth, but we could give him everything that we have. Then as she continues to worship, this beautiful picture of worship, she stood behind him at his feet weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. It was emotional to her. This wasn't a stiff upper lip moment. This was something she was moved. There was passion. Now, we're all different. Some of us, I'm sure, in this room are deeply emotional people. We just have to watch an advert with a dog in it and we're gone. Some of us, we won't be that emotional. We won't express our emotions as freely as other people. Worship is not a personality type. Worship is not just for people who have a certain demeanor and a certain way of expressing themselves in the world. But all of us are people with emotion. All of us are people who are meant to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, with all of our being, including our feelings. There's not a single person here or listening who has never been moved by anything. What you did with it, what it looked like. For some people, just a simple wry smile expresses far more emotion than someone else belly laughing. For some people, a belly laugh is cheap, but a wry smile is hard-earned. The same is true of being moved, of feeling, of crying. For some of us, that comes so naturally, and for others, it doesn't. The way that we express ourselves will look different from person to person. But when was the last time that Jesus moved you? When was the last time that you were caught up in something, that you felt something deep and personal and moving because of what Jesus had done, because of who he is, because of something you wanted to express to him? I believe that being a worshipper, a passionate worshipper of Jesus looks like that, and it's extravagant. What she didn't make any sense. It wasn't sensible. If she has this great big alabaster jar, well, this alabaster jar, we don't know how big it was, I'm exaggerating. But if she had this jar that she'd spent a lot of money on, then sound financial planning would have said, measure out a little bit, take it to Jesus, offer that to him, and you'll still have some left over for another time. She didn't do that. Her worship is extravagant. We might look at that and go, well, it's foolish, it's stupid, it's silly. Yes, that's the point. Our worship of Jesus sometimes needs to look extravagant. Compare her, though, with this Pharisee. We've already seen that he was more interested in inviting Jesus to him than he was in going to Jesus himself. But then, when he sees this woman doing this thing, he suddenly steps into a very judgmental tone. If he knew who she was, the things that she'd done, then he wouldn't want anything to do with her. I'll be honest, I see that in myself sometimes. Sometimes instead of passionately pursuing a life lived towards Jesus, I'm casting sideways glances at other people to see whether they're doing it right or wrong. As if somehow I've got the monopoly on what's right and wrong. As if somehow I can stand in the judging seat and decide what the motive of someone else's heart is. Decide whether their worship is pure. Decide whether their worship should mean anything to Jesus. How dare I? And yet I do it. I'm sure we all do. So the question, the million-dollar question is this. How do we become worshippers who are less like a Pharisee and more like this sinful woman? Because I can try and muster that up. I can try and sort myself out. I can try and love Jesus more. I can try and be less focused on me. I can try and be more focused on him. I can try and be more extravagant. I can try and make myself be moved by Jesus, but I can't. As we read on, Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You've judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say amongst themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Jesus uses this simple parable, one person who's been forgiven about 2 months' wages worth of debt, a reasonable amount, a significant amount, and another person who's been forgiven about 1.5 years' wages worth of debt, a huge amount, a massive amount. A life-changing amount to suddenly be written off in a moment. And he asks the simple question. It's not a trick question. It's one of those questions of Jesus that has an obvious answer. And he says, who's going to be most grateful? And he says, well, the person who's been forgiven the biggest debt. And he says, you're absolutely right. But now look at your actions compared with this woman. And what does that show? If she has that much love and gratitude towards you, and yet you've been fairly distant, fairly sensible, fairly cold almost maybe. What does that show about who loves me the most? What does that show about who realizes that they've been forgiven the most? Now, the Pharisee might have heard this story and then gone, oh, okay, you're right. I don't need to be forgiven very much, and so I guess I should be less extravagant in my thanks. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story isn't, well, some of us are worse than others, and so some of us should be less grateful towards Jesus. The measure of your worship should match how bad your life has been. That's not the point of this story at all. Because as we understand what Jesus has done more fully, we realize that all of us have been forgiven infinitely. And so all of us should love infinitely. The only thing that I can say to you is that An overwhelming worship of Jesus can only come from being overwhelmed by what Jesus has done. An overwhelming worship of Jesus can only come from being overwhelmed by what Jesus has done. We can't sit here and try and muster it up. But if you want your life to be a more passionate and vibrant and extravagant and excited and moved expression of worship and love to Jesus, then the only advice I can give you is this: remind yourself every moment that you can of what Jesus has done. Remind yourself who you were without him. And I don't mean just because you might have had a really rubbish life and you were doing all sorts of horrendous things. For a lot of us, that isn't our story. For me, that's not my story. I wasn't a horrendous person who was caught up in all kinds of terrible things, and then I met Jesus and now I'm a perfect saint. The before story wasn't true of me, and the after story definitely isn't true either. But I used to be dead and now I'm alive. That's what we've been singing, isn't it? I used to be lost and now I'm found. That's the story of my life. That's what Jesus has done for me and for you if you know him. To remind ourselves of that is the only way, I believe, that we can rekindle or recultivate this life of devotion and worship. Self-sufficiency is the enemy of worship. Pride is the enemy of worship. Remembering that we brought nothing to the table and Jesus brought everything. That's how we become passionate worshippers. For some of us, that might be how we need to become passionate worshippers again, because we've got tired or we've got stale or we've got cold. Can I ask you to close your eyes? If you are a Christian, let these truths sink in. That it was while you were a sinner that Jesus Christ died for you. That it was before you cared for his name at all that he died so that your name might be written in his book of life. That he hung from that cross, forsaken by his Father. The Trinity torn in two because of his love for you. Remember. Remind yourself. Think back to things in your life that have only been true because you've known Jesus. Think back to times when that was the only hope you had. Think back to times in your life where it was the only joy. Think back to times of breakthrough and triumph and victory. Only possible because of the overwhelming victory of Jesus. Tell Jesus again that you're grateful. Thank him. Thank him. We're never going to give Jesus worship that's costly unless we remember the cost that he paid. We're never going to give Jesus worship that's extravagant unless we remember the extravagance of his love on display for us. We're never going to live our lives running after him unless we remember that he first came for us. Lord Jesus, we love you. We thank you, we praise you. We honor you for the things that you have done for us. And we know that our lives, though they are small, they matter to you. And you want every single moment of our lives to be lived in response to who you are, response to what you've done. So as we worship you in this space physically and this space in our week that we've carved out for you, I ask that what happens here and the pattern of our worship now would set us up to live life in worship to you each moment and each day. Help us every day this week to remind ourselves, to call ourselves back to what you've done for us, to remember that we have been forgiven not just much, not just very much, but infinitely. We thank you for that. We praise you for that. By your Spirit, would you make us able to respond as fully as we can. In Jesus' name, amen.